Hello and welcome to Moneylife News and Views. It's now official. Economic growth rates are not going to be any better than this, or just marginally better. The growth of India's GDP, that is gross domestic product, dropped to just 4.5% in the second quarter of this fiscal. In the first quarter, the growth was just 5%. And for the entire year, it will be just about the same 4.5 to 5%, not more than that. Based on the old methodology, actually the growth rate is much less. It's almost 2% lower. So we are actually doing only 2.5%. Despondency or concern is all around. How is it that despite being ruled by someone called Vikas Purush for more than 5 years, growth has crashed from 7% of something around that we were averaging for the whole of last decade to just 2.5%. The common man is no wiser because there's hardly any cogent official explanation explaining the crash in growth rates. We only get silly sound bites from party hacks and lackeys. Well, somewhat official arguments are now available. Vivek Debroy, a member of the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council, has written a piece in a magazine explaining what to make of the slowdown. Here are his main arguments, and that they are not very uplifting. Argument number 1. Well, we're still doing 5%, so be happy. India remains among the fastest growing economies in the world. When people talk of recession, Mr. Debra reminds us they don't realize that recession is very well defined in economics, which is a shrinkage in GDP over 2 successive quarters. This is true. There's no recession right now, but Mr. Debra misses the point of expectations versus reality. Did people vote for a better or a worse outcome? In 2014, did anyone honestly expect just a 2.5% GDP growth after 5 years of Modi Raj? Doesn't this call for some serious introspection than glibly dismissing all concerns with 5% is not so bad kind of an argument? Argument number 2. Inflation is also low, so be happy. GDP figures are adjusted for inflation. So when we say it's 5% growth and inflation is around 3%, the nominal growth is actually 8%. One of the major successes of the government since 2014 has been keeping inflation low, which we don't seem to appreciate enough, according to Mr. Debroy. Inflation hurts the poor more, he argues, which is correct. We would have been far worse, he says, with 5% real growth, 10% inflation, and a nominal growth of 15%, he reminds us. Well, there are several issues here. Low inflation is an outcome of low aggregate demand. It's not an entirely independent variable. Because of the various actions and inactions of this government, growth and therefore inflation is down. Low inflation was an unintended consequence in that sense, which is now being touted as an achievement. There is no evidence to say that bringing down inflation to give relief to the poor was a policy objective of the Modi government. In fact, one of the often repeated grand promises of Modi Raj was to double farmers' income. This would have meant massive food inflation given that India is not a significant agricultural exporter. Argument number 3, which is blame weak trade, not the government. At least 3 percentage points of GDP growth comes from exports, argues Mr. Debroy. If export growth peters out, we go down to 6% GDP growth rate. 3 factors influence exports, and according to him, these are demand, that's global demand, supply, and exchange rate. The government cannot do anything about the first, which is global demand, and also exchange rate. And as for supply, the government has introduced measures to improve logistics. That's all he has to say, and so he breezily says net exports will continue to be a constraint. If all this sounds too pat, academic, and unconnected to what is happening on the ground, it actually is. In 2010, China's shares of worldwide export of textiles was 36.6%, which went down to 31.3% in 2018 due to higher labor cost and other structural changes which were all well planned. Which countries benefited? Not India. Vietnam's share shot up from 2.9 to 6.2. Bangladesh's share went up from 4.2 to 6.4, and India's share actually went down from 3.3 to 3.2. Why is this so? Because although India has got such a large textile industry, because of enormous frictional cost of doing business in India imposed by central and state governments. This needs to be fixed through structural reforms, but that is a pointless argument according to Mr. Debashis. That takes us to this next argument. Argument number 4. Structural versus cyclical slowdown. It's pointless. There is a slightly sterile debate that goes on about structural versus cyclical diagnosis, writes Mr. Debashis. Why is it sterile? Because here again, the government is helpless, he suggests. He assumes that structural changes only means privatization and changes in labor and land laws. Privatization is a process, well, everything is a process, that cannot be rushed through. No, it can't be rushed through, but various kinds of legislations can be rushed through, which helps the government. Legislative changes may be necessary and one may have to go back to the parliament. While land, the most valuable asset, is typically owned by state governments, it cannot be sold by the union government. Land and labor are partly state subjects, and the Land Acquisition Act of 2013 has raised land costs and made infrastructure projects difficult, points out Mr. Debashis. The all India growth rate is a function of what happens in state governments according to him. This is actually very true, and so he absolves the union government by saying, well, the central government can't do much. Well, structural reforms are much less about privatization, land and labor, and more about expanding the scope of private enterprises and allowing them to be more competitive and productive. This should start with removal of enormous frictional cost of doing business in India and reducing corruption in the states. How can this government do it? Well, my question is, how can this government not? In a piece in 2015, I asked, why cannot PM Modi, who is the party's only vote getter, even in state elections, work with BJP-controlled states and show us what reforms can be achieved at the state level in the states where BJP rules? Didn't we vote to see the Gujarat model replicated in Uttar Pradesh? Where is that happening? So net, according to Mr. Debashis, there is no gloom and doom in 5% growth. It will pick up to 6% next year, but don't expect much more. His arguments throw very useful light on what you can expect this government to do about the slowdown, something we are all clamoring to know. The answer is not much. Thanks for watching.